Thank you very much indeed for coming to this session with Hisham Matar about his second novel, Anatomy of Disappearance, or Anatomy of Disappearance. Hisham, I'm just going to, for those who haven't read the novel, I'm just going to quickly outline the story so that people can follow it. It's a story of an only child as the narrator, and the child's mother dies when the boy is 10 years old. And the novel begins in 1972 when Nouri, the boy, is 14 years old, and the family's been living in Egypt since 1958 from our country. It's not clear which country that is, although there are some clues that it could be Iraq. His father is a diplomat and a diplomatic advisor to the young king. And he then works as an ex-minister and a leading dissident. And it's the relationship between the boy and the father and his new wife. So there's a triangle at the heart of the story. And also at the heart of the story is what happens to the relationship between the boy and his stepmother when the father disappears. Hisham, let's start by talking about the narrator, because this is the second book that you have chosen to have the narrator as a child. And I wondered why you were drawn again to the voice and the perception of a child.
Well, good morning, Razia, and good morning to everyone. And thank you for coming to the event first thing in the morning. It seems to me one of the most commonplace things, of course, is the family. No, we all belong in one way or another to probably more than one family, to families. Can everybody hear me, or?
There's quite a lot of feedback on this mic, actually, on Hisham's mic in particular.
And it seems that it's a place of immense interest to me. I forget now who it was, the poet, that said, "Oh, that most dangerous place of all, the family." I mean, you know, all of the real violence occurs within the family, social violence and sometimes not, but also all the real drama, all the real love and pain and anguish and longing. And it seems a test to the human heart in the sense that we are all, of course, born into these people that we many times have very little in common with, but love. So the way that trains the heart, I think, is very interesting to a novelist. But also, we're not only born into these people, but we're born into their narratives, into their histories, into a pattern. And we are almost never given the inventory of that pattern. You know, we sort of have to discover it ourselves, and right? So I think that is why historically the family has been such a central part of drama. If you think of Shakespeare, if you think of the Greek tragedies, and of course of the novel. In the case of, you know, why are they both children? Well, they're actually adults who are reflecting at certain parts of their childhood, thinking about how did this actually come about, right? And so it's an obsession with childhood rather than or things that have happened during childhood. And I think one of the reasons, I mean, and here I have to just say something very basic, which is I'm here not speaking as the man who wrote these books, because as I was writing them, I was the man writing those books. And I knew all of the answers, in a sense, and I functioned in a way that was much more instinctive and organic. I didn't think about it intellectually. I thought about it sometimes intellectually, but oftentimes I followed my hunch, my instinct, what felt right, what felt true, right? But now I am in this position that all authors are put in. After you finish your book, you have to, in a sense, talk about it. And I always found this distance interesting, because on some level I do feel maybe the least authoritative person, you know, on the book.
This is rather alarming to me.
Yeah. No, but I think it's actually it's characteristic of the distance that grows between the writer and the work once the work is finished. No, a reader, I think, can have keys to the work that are not available to the writer. In other words, I cannot actually read my book. You know, I can write it, but I can't read it. But speaking as a reader, trying to speak as a reader from this distance, my hypothesis about why they're both children is that both books are dealing with families that are caught in incredibly dramatic political narratives, social political narratives. They're caught in history, in other words, and they're implicated into these histories. And it seems to me there's a wonderful parallel between the relationship of children to their families and the relationship of these families to these larger narratives. Because children aren't told the whole story. They're never told the whole story. They discover it slowly, they fill in the gaps. And similarly, perhaps families born within history, we are all born within history, but families that are born within a particularly urgent, demanding, perhaps even violent, dangerous history are also not told the whole story.
Tell me why then you decided to not name the country in the second novel. I mean, there are hints that it could be Iraq, but there's no definitive description of a place in the way that in The Country of Men, it's very clearly Libya, it's very clearly Tripoli, and so on, so because of you know that it's rooted in a place. Why did you decide then to make it ambiguous?
Many Arabic families from across the Middle East who were displaced either because of their political position or so on ended up in Egypt. So Egypt was really a place that many went to, and there are many reasons for this. And so in Egypt you would find families from Iraq, from Libya, from various other countries who fell between the gap of the two major chapters in the Arab world, in the political history of the Arab world, where you have the post-colonial monarchies, and then you have the Republican revolutions spearheaded by Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And there were families that were very much part of the monarchy, or the political system of the monarchies, that really had no space. They didn't know, they couldn't convert, they weren't allowed to convert, as it were, or to transform into the new order, and they were kicked out. And so it's an existential position that seems to me really interesting. And so I chose a family like that, and it seemed to me that they are not necessarily representative. I don't think anything in my books is representative of a larger. I hope not. But it's they do represent on some level other families like that. And what I was really interested in is their existential displacement rather than the narrative of the national story. Whereas in The Country of Men is very much a book that is set in Libya about Libyan events.
There are many themes in this book, but the overarching one is about loss and longing. Let's talk about the longing part first, because at the heart of the book is the desire and the longing of this 14-year-old boy for his stepmother, who he almost immediately falls in love with when he sees her I think he sees her in the shower first, and then there's the bikini scene. There's a yellow bikini scene. But in many respects, you could read this on just on the veneer as a rites of passage novel in terms of the erotic and the sexual journey of this boy, because it feels so tense for him. The longing for him for her is so tense in the mind of Nouri. I wondered if you could just say something about why that aspect of the story was really important to you, because it does propel. We'll talk about the disappearance in a minute, but it does propel the story along.
That's a very difficult question to answer for me because it's a very good question, so I feel I ought to answer it properly. But I will have to be sort of making things up to answer it properly because the honest answer is...
You're a novelist, you make things up, it's fine.
The honest answer is I don't know. I really don't know. It just, it happened that way. Maybe if I were to theorize about why, I've always been interested in the nature in which intimacy seems to excite a kind of, or rely on mystery, right? So, in other words, you know, the desire of the beloved is to completely devour the beloved. But if you devour the beloved, then the desire will die. So desire is reliant on, dependent on a sense of mystery. And I just know it from my own life that the people that I am closest to, they're also the most mysterious people to me. You know, there are moments that I feel that it's not mysterious in the sense of things to do with trust or not knowing them in that way, or not being able to rely on them. But they're mysterious, you know, what they're really thinking about, what they're really feeling, what, you know, because we're moving all the time, and it seems to me, even with myself, it seems I'm not entirely clear about how I feel about certain things, and my feelings surprise me sometimes. I think this happens to all of us at certain moments when we're put in the situation, we behave in a certain way that, in a sense, reveals to us how we really feel about it. And I think that relationship between mystery and intimacy is central to this book. So there's a son and his father, and the son has a very deep desire to know more about his father, who is secretive. And Mona is the person that stands between them, and she is the one that allows them, in a sense, to exercise this problem between them. But then, of course, when he disappears, it all becomes incredibly, you know, overcomplicated for him, because his longing for his father is not the sort of longing that I would. It's not my longing necessarily. You know, the longing of a son who is you know, searching for his father, doing all the active things to find out what actually happened, or what his father might want to happen now that he's not here, that he might do it in his place. His longing was very curious to me as a writer, because it's a longing of somebody who just wants to know, if his father had sat in that chair, he'd just go and sit in that chair. His father had taken a photograph of his father in a street corner, he'll just go and stand at that street corner. So it's a very deeply personal, quiet longing that I found very interesting.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about it not being your longing, because there is an autobiographical compulsion behind this book, and obviously the first book too. The book opens with the lines, "There are times when my father's absence is as heavy as a child sitting on my chest." And I wondered if, for those who don't know your family story, whether you will just tell us a little bit about the disappearance of your father, Jabal Matar.
Yes, I think because I also lost my father to a political disappearance. My father was a Libyan dissident who was kidnapped from his place of exile in Egypt and handed over to the Libyan secret services, and vanished, as several Libyan political prisoners have vanished in the prison system. So you don't know what happened to them, you don't have contact, but also you don't know how they died or where they're buried and so on. So this is my own personal tragedy. But as a novelist, I think what you always try, I think what I'm doing is very similar to any other novelist, is that you take something that you have learned, something that has perhaps been revealed to you momentarily, and you try to make art out of it. And so what this experience taught me is it taught me something, I think, valuable about the nature of loss, the nature of grief. that is universal. It's not just particular to people who have lost someone in this way. See, when someone passes away, someone we know well and dies, it's terribly painful, it's terribly tragic, it rocks the world. But also there's something final about it. It's exactly also what's tormenting about it, is its finality. But there's something final about it, and there's usually, if we're lucky, a place we can go to, and we know that they are buried here, and we could do whatever it is that we do depending on our own personal beliefs. Sing a song, sing a prayer, you know, whatever ritual. See, when someone disappears, you have none of these things. But not only do you not have any of these things, you spend years, in my case, over 25 years, the majority of my life, where the possibility that they exist at this exact moment, this exact second, under the same moon, under the same sun, is a vivid one, a real one. And it alters, from my experience, it alters the way that you experience the world, the way that you look at a painting, the way that you listen to a symphony, the way that you prepare your meal, you know, the pleasure and sorrow of a new piece of garment that you buy. No, it alters lots of things in details. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be such a wonderful act of rebellion to take this experience that is, you know, that has arrived to me through dispossession? Because remember, the political intent in making somebody disappear is silencing them, retarding them, and also silencing their families out of fear, right, for them, because you don't want to speak in case they are alive and something might happen to them. And so, wouldn't it be a wonderful act of rebellion to take this act of extreme violence and dispossession and make something of it? Make something that maybe someone else with a completely different experience would find a connection with. That loss, this very particular loss, has strains in it. It has characteristics in it that are universal, I think, even to somebody who hasn't lost anything, you know, yeah.
In both the first novel and in this one, you do that incredibly well. The minutiae of daily life and the impact on daily life of disappearance, of dispossession, of mystery, of not knowing. And in this second novel, you almost treat the finding out of the father's whereabouts as a detective novel. Both Mona and Nouri have to unearth clues, and I felt that gave the novel a kind of tightness of thriller writing almost. I wondered if you thought that you were thinking that as you were writing it, having said right at the beginning that you're now talking about the novel as a reader. I wonder whether you can cast your mind back, and when you were writing it, did you think, yes, this is what I need to do? These two people are now responding to the disappearance of somebody they love. What do they now do?
The section that Razia is referring to is actually quite a short section, but you're right. It has a thriller character to it, and I felt it is necessary because you would have noticed that through it there is this withdrawing. You know, they try to find out in a kind of investigative way for a bit, but then they withdraw, or he does particularly withdraw into a place of private searching, in a sense, that isn't involved with other people. And perhaps, again, guessing about why I did that is because I discovered that there was something paradoxical about my search, a paradoxical outcome of my search for my father, which was much more active than Nouri's. You know, I campaigned, I went around, spoke about it, I wrote letters endlessly, we had a campaign, and you know, things that Nouri would never do, right? And I remember at the height of our campaign, there was particularly these hot 3 months when I practically never slept. I would not sleep, and then I would collapse for a day and sleep the whole day, and then, you know, because so much was going on, there was sense of momentum gathering around the case of the disappearance of my father. And I had a dream within those 3 months, in one of those rare moments of sleep, when my father came and he was sort of saying to me, you know, where have you been? You know, you haven't been paying attention to me. And the peculiar thing is that during those 3 months, I really didn't feel close to him. So it made me think a lot about the nature of longing. That, you know, who is the more faithful, or who's the person who's longing more authentically? The person who is running around trying to do something about it, or the person who is quietly trying to remember what it is, trying to you know, feel the memory of someone, remember the things that bound you to them, and also be actively in a state of love for them. You know, all of those things. You know, there is an argument in my mind about which one is more authentic, because they're both very difficult to balance, no, at the same time. At least I wasn't able to. It was always one or the other for me. So.
But in the novel, it's really the perspective of the story is the boys, and you could argue that the anatomy of disappearance is just as much his as it is of the father. Absolutely. Because there is a loss of him as well.
Absolutely. I think and this, you read this in lots of testimonies that have been given by the families of people who have disappeared in Libya and Iraq and Argentina, of course, that there is a sense of that somehow you are put in a place of abstraction, because, as I mentioned before, if you lose somebody to death, if you're lucky enough, you can pick up the pieces and find another way of being in the world without them. But when somebody is suspended in that state of always a possible return, then that is much more difficult to do. And also, you know, one thing that is very difficult to admit for a lot of families of the disappeared is that when you know, the more the years pass, your desire to find them and to be reunited with them keeps going up and up and up and up. But also, the secret, shameful desire to never find them is also going up and up and up. Because finding them is as wonderful as it is frightening, because people change, no? And I think perhaps what we worry the most about losing people we love, or fearing that somebody we love has been through some terrible event or an accident or some near, you know, death experience, is perhaps both losing them in the literal sense, but also having them altered by that experience, and therefore possibly, you know, feel the resonance of history and politics. And I think this is not an unusual thing, because I think the novel is, as a form, implicated in history. It is, you know, whatever you write about, it's very difficult to write outside of history, even if you're writing a science fiction book or a book that has only animals in it. Or, you know, you're in some way engaging in the history of ideas, in the history of our human history. Yeah.
When you'd finished writing this novel, it seemed to me that you were thrust into a world that was very gone.
So can I just add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Because I just remembered, relates to what your last question was about. Yesterday, when Abdul Kalam came and spoke here at the festival, I was really taken by the way that he focused on the specific. You know, the way he said, I will not engage in corruption. I will, and I've heard him speak elsewhere where he would say, promise me that you will dress your kids correctly for school in the morning. These kind of specific things are, I think, deeply profound. I mean, it's Socratic. I mean, that's what,
But let's talk about what happened pretty soon after you'd finished the novel, because the revolution reached Libya, and you were thrust into a world where you weren't a novelist anymore, and in some respects you became a journalist. You were trying to find out what was happening in your home country, and almost what was being thrust upon you was that you became a conduit for the rest of the world in terms of interpreting Libya. How did that feel, given that you are as you say, again and again so drawn to literature, and you're now a novelist, having trained as an architect. I just wonder about that period of time which was so intense, not least for you. What was that like, to think differently, and not, did you have to find that you were thinking not as a novelist, but also as somebody who was investigating what was going on?
Yeah, you know, revolutions they're traumatic events. They're not the ideal way to change things. I've never been one of those who sentimentalizes revolutions or idealizes them. I've always found them incredibly disruptive, even when I read history. And so to be thrust in the middle of one was, you know, somehow confirmed that to me, you know, but it was, we had very little option, you know, revolutions are disruptive, but dictatorship is also incredibly, deeply disruptive, you know. We've had one for 42 years that was, you know, for me to list the ways in which it damaged our society would take a very long time. It's you know, its effects are still not entirely known to us even, you know. So at that moment when the public imagination in Libya was able to see a way through it, a way on the other side for a moment, that was an incredibly powerful moment, and I was swept. I was swept by it, and I felt that I wanted to not be a mouthpiece for it, but to be somebody who is trying to observe, trying to get information, trying to chronicle some aspects of it. And it was like exercising a different muscle for me as a writer, because I'm a novelist, I'm not a journalist, but I'm very glad I did that, because it was a very, very significant moment. And notwithstanding all of the awful things that are happening now, and the way that our dream is, hopefully temporarily, has been, you know, challenged very powerfully through violence and the civil war that we're going through. I still believe that you know, what occurred then is going to reverberate for generations in Libyan history. That's why when I hear people say the Arab Spring, what Arab Spring? What are you talking about? It's the Arab winter. And I think it's unfortunate, because I understand why they're saying these things, but it's an abbreviation of a much more complex process. In the Middle East, by the way, we call it more the Arab awakening than the Arab Spring, which I think is more accurate. But also I am resistant to the generalization of the Arab, you know? I mean, it should be the Libyan awakening, the Tunisian awakening, no? And each one is slightly different. But in Libya, it is very difficult to make vivid very quickly here to what extent we as a people couldn't see beyond Gaddafi. You know, part of the genius of his dictatorship was that it seemed like there was nothing else that would be possible. And there was a moment when, during the revolution, when not only did we see that there was another possibility, but that possibility was really quite beautiful. And I think of it a bit as in, you know, and I'm not at all anything but enlightened, but, you know, the mystics in all the different traditions speak about glimpses, you know, towards enlightenment. There are glimpses, there are moments when you just glimpse the possibility, and then it goes away. I mean, in my own ordinary life, I think of it almost as like in learning, you know, when you're a student and you're confronted with some incredibly complicated subject, and you want to bluff your way through the class, and you don't want to admit your ignorance. And then there are certain moments in the course when somebody says something and you think, oh, it all falls into place, oh, now it all makes sense. Now I understand it, right? And that glimpse maybe gets clouded, and then there'll be another one and another one before you get the whole story. And the revolution in Libya was something like that for us. It was one of the very, very few moments that in our very short history as a country, we glimpsed the possibility of something much more dignified than than what we had for close to half a century.
I'm very interested in hearing you talk about the effects of the revolution are still to be dissected, are still yet to be learned and known about. And that, of course, provides a very rich subject matter for a novelist, because it's in the unknown, it's in the way in which we might feel the repercussions of something very big in our small lives that make the subject of all sorts of stories. So how much do you spend thinking about the reverberations on a personal level? I don't necessarily mean for you, but I mean on people, on the Libyan people, in terms of many people's willingness to betray their families, people's ability to live with fear for as long as they have, the impact that makes on daily lives. How much do you spend time thinking about those being the things that are going to give you your stories from now on?
A great deal. I mean, I think about them a great deal. I don't know if I think about them as a novelist. I think about them just as a human being. I think about them a lot. Because it seems to me that we live in a time where history is moving at a faster pace, and it's a challenge to us all. Certainly a challenge to me as a novelist. And how do you then respond to this moment? Having said all of that, this is sort of the thinking novelist thinking. You know? The writing novelist writing doesn't think, really doesn't. I mean, when I'm sitting down writing, I don't analyze. I analyze when I'm editing, when I'm reading. But something interesting happens when I'm writing that is difficult to describe. But at that moment, I'm not anything. I'm not Libyan. I'm not a man. I don't think in those ways, you know. So that's why I'm always taken aback when I'm described as a Libyan writer. I know why I'm described. I am, of course, a Libyan writer. But when I'm writing, I'm not a Libyan writer. I'm not anything, right? There's something that is a writer that whose work I profoundly admire and return to oftentimes, maybe perversely, because he's written such a huge book made up of 7 volumes called Remembrance of Things Past. He's a French writer called Marcel Proust. And I'm probably, you know, my friends think it's very peculiar that I've read these books more than 3-4 times, because they're quite an undertaking. But in the 6th volume of this wonderful novel, a volume that's called The Captive, there is a scene of a man who is dying. He's dying, and he's denying that he's dying. He's hoping that he's not going to fade. But he's also looking at that moment at a painting by Vermeer. And he's looking at the yellow wall in the painting. And he can't quite understand what it took to paint a yellow wall full of such resonance, such feeling, such ideas and emotion and psychology. How can you do that? What does it take to be able to do that? When surely the world doesn't need a yellow wall, right? And he comes up with this trilogy. He says that possibly what it needs is kindness, scrupulosity, and self-sacrifice. And that really echoes deeply with me. I do think of writing in that sense, that you do, in order to write about somebody doing a horrible crime, say somebody torturing someone, you still have to be, your faculty of kindness has to be very active at that moment, because you have to be both the torturer and the tortured, you know? And scrupulosity and self-sacrifice. So I think that makes a lot of sense for me. So that's the place where I'm at. And I hope that I position myself in such a way that if anything, I become an expression of others. You know, I become a kind of symptom. I think novels are symptoms of their time and of their place. So it's a very on some level you need to put yourself in a slightly selfless position, of service. And it's very difficult because the occupational hazard of writers is arrogance, because we are alone all the time, and as far as we're concerned, we're the only writers. And writers are very sensitive about other writers being praised in their company and so on, and worrying about what someone said about this is a real occupational hazard, and it seems to me that what the writing needs is something completely different from that.
When you talk about the fictions and the narratives created by dictators, the ones that they should replace are the fictions created by novelists, and I wonder about the access that people have to your books. Have they both been translated into Arabic, and have people responded to them if they have been?
Yes, they were translated before, but they were banned in Libya before, and obviously now they're, after the revolution, they're available there. But the situation now is so extreme that, just to give you a quick example, immediately after the revolution, we had a flourishing of newspapers, literary journals, journalism in general. I mean, we went from the place where we had we just had the state newspapers, to having 160 newspapers and magazines in the space of a year. It was extraordinary. But now, of course, the situation is very difficult for writers and journalists because of the civil war.
And you've been back to Libya, haven't you, for the first time since when?
33 years.
You've also written about it a little bit in the New Yorker. Just give us a sense of your impressions, because so much of it, I know, is likely to inform your writing from now on.
Well, it was a very powerful trip, and a trip that I worried about, naturally, because I didn't want the modern Libya to obliterate the Libya of my childhood, because notwithstanding all of these horrible stories I'm telling you about my relationship to Libya, my childhood in Libya was just idyllic. It was beautiful, and so I worried. I had that anxiety. Nabokov speaks about that anxiety, about not wanting to go back to Russia because it will obliterate the Russia of his childhood. But my instinct was to stay very close to the ground. I always want to be as close as possible to the ground, as close as possible to all of the complexities, the dirt, the unevenness of the earth. That's where I want to be. And so I thought, go and see it. And it was very powerful, very dramatic. Amusingly, in my nuclear family, I only have one sibling, my brother and I. But each one of us has one sibling, but we both have 130 first cousins. So I come from a very large family, and a family where the second cousin is very important too. So basically, you're related to hundreds of people, and it's a wonderful allegory for being a human being, because we are all related to millions and millions of people, to all of humanity. But to see it in this vivid way, where one cousin is a professor at a university, another cousin is a doctor, another one is a key cutter in the market, another one, so it connects you to the fabric of the country in a way that was very powerful for me. And so I've written that piece for the New Yorker. It was a long piece, and it really instigated a longer work that I'm working on now, which is going to be a book.
Let's open the questions up to the floor. Please wait until you have a microphone in your hand, and if you can keep your questions short-ish so we can get as many in as possible, that would be great. Great. Yeah. Gentleman there.
Hi, good morning. I just want to ask you a couple of questions about what you spoke about. Firstly, you said that the genius of Gaddafi's dictatorship was that you couldn't see beyond it, and I mean, you couldn't think about anything else. So if you could describe why was that and what was that like? And secondly, you spoke about revolution being disruptive in many ways. So the question that comes to my mind is, what is the other alternative? If it is an idealistic world, what is the other alternative that you might have which is not a revolution? Thank you.
Well, the dictatorship silenced any discourse. It banned any opposition parties. It enforced its authority with incredible power. And therefore, it was very difficult to imagine anything else, you know. I mean, in the first 10, 20 years, there was that possibility. But then when it went on for 40 years, you could just feel it, you know. People are just waiting for what they call the Franco solution, you know, wait for him to die, right? But also, something else to say about that is that Libya is an overwhelmingly young country. So the majority of our population was born after Gaddafi came to power. So there was no even an imaginative, you know, possibility to sort of think back and say, okay, you know, it was different once, therefore it will be different again. So those are some of the reasons why it felt eternal on some level. And he was grooming his son and so on. So we felt trapped. Why revolutions are destructive? I meant it more as a general statement. You know, revolutions are they are revolutions. You know, they are things that are incredibly unsettling, disruptive, often violent. They demand too much certainty. They demand too much fervor. And so they're not the ideal way. Sometimes, as in this case, there seemed to be no other way. They're not the ideal way, personally, I think.
Hi, Hisham. Welcome to Jaipur. You wrote an introduction to Virginia Woolf's book, and that New Yorker essay reads in itself a perfect literature composition. So I need to know, how do you approach an essay? And by the medium of this particular essay, show us a bit about how do you structure them and go about it.
Well, thank you for that. She's a writer. Virginia Woolf is a writer that has been very important to me, and I enjoyed reading her work closely, but also to see the parallels between some of the things that she faced in her time, being a woman, and also being at that critical moment of, during First World War and the dramatic changes that her society underwent there, and the incredibly deep spiritual, intellectual complexity of witnessing your own butcher and be butchered. You know, all of those things I found very interesting to engage with at this time. So I spent the summer rereading her, and it's something I enjoy doing, is reading writers chronologically, you know, from the first thing that they've written to the last, and seeing how they have discovered things on the way, how they've learned, how they've modified, how they've perhaps taken a step back or a step to one side, and just really tracing her work that way. That's.
Hi.
Hello.
Good morning. Yes, I want to ask about your views on how we can distinguish between the Mubarak's revolution in Egypt and Gaddafi's rule in Libya. Sorry, I'm not being good with words.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Maybe bring the mic closer to
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how we can distinguish between Mubarak's rule in Egypt and Gaddafi's rule in
Mubarak versus Gaddafi.
Right. Yeah. Oh gosh. One of the biggest differences is that Egypt is a much older country, and therefore it still continues to have institutions, very weak institutions, but nonetheless there are institutions. The strongest institution is the institution that now has overtaken the political process, which is the military. The military in Egypt controls more than half of the economy. It is the true elite in Egypt. They have the best hospitals, the best cars, the best schools, the best holiday homes. They even get a different grade of milk. You know, I mean, they are the true elite in Egypt. And Libya is a much more fractured society. You know, and also I think that it's a legacy of our particularly vile colonial experience. We had a European, Italy, rule us with very, very dire consequences. For example, something that's very different from Egypt is that the Italians deliberately did not educate the Libyan population. They educated people, a small minority, up to 3rd grade, just so as you could read the letters, the address on the letters, so you could deliver the mail. So when we gained our independence in 52, we had, depending on the historian that you read, between 8 and 12 people with a high school degree. It was a very difficult beginning. That our first university was built in 1959. So that, you know, that has had huge consequences on us. And even then, they only built 1 faculty. And then, you know, over the next 10 years, they built more faculties. Yeah, you know, interestingly, you'd be interested to know that when I was in Libya last time, I met several of the professors in the literature departments in the university in Benghazi, and in the university in Darna, and in the university in Jidabia, and in the university in Tripoli, of course. And all of them are from India. All of them are Indian professors. So when you're in Libya, India feels very close. It does. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? There's one in the front, just here. Oh,
Sorry.
well, sorry, we'll come to you next. Somebody's got a microphone at the back.
Yeah, I was interested in your take on the tension between what you call political abstractions or lies and I guess what I'd call collective abstractions or hopes. You know, I mean, regardless of how problematic some of his other stuff might have been, Samuel Huntington was really famous because he said critics of America say that America is a lie, but it's not a lie, it's a disappointment. And it can only be a disappointment because it is also a hope. So in the context of Libya and Egypt, I was just wondering, you've mentioned that you're not necessarily supportive of a revolutionary way to building that sort of consensus that makes a hope. What would you view as the ideal way of building that hope, perhaps over time?
I don't know, hope is a word, it's a complicated word for me. You know, I don't, you know, when people say, you know, I'm living in hope, hope springs eternal. You know, these don't seem to be very good places to be somehow. Living in hope doesn't seem to be a good place to be. So I believe more in the sort of the completely unsexy, you know, small incremental steps of working and building things. And I think that's what's happening there. I mean, you know, to be encouraged is to see the young Libyans and what they're doing within the very small space that's allowed to them you know, by the violence. And you know, revolutions aren't these things that are these dramatic things that sort of suddenly, it's not a Hollywood film, you know, suddenly boom, you know, everything is solved. It's an engagement with history in a very active way, and people have, some of them have died, and some of them are spending time in prison in Egypt, have committed to this, you know, a whole generation. When I was growing up in Cairo and in Libya, I would meet people who had spent a decade in prison under Jamal Abdel Nasser. And then later on, in my 20s, I would meet people who had spent the same amount of time under Sadat. And now we have this new generation of people that we're going to see in 30 years' time. Would say, I spent several years under Sisi or under, you know. So it's tragic. What's happening is heartbreaking, but it's also an engagement with our history. We don't have an option.
I think we've got time for one last question here in the front. Thanks.
When one has been part of political, social or cultural upheaval or personally suffered certain loss or tragedy, is it better to record or write about it when the cut is raw, or later when one can think about it, reflect on it, and then one should pen it down? What has been your personal experience in this regard? Thank you.
I think your question, you know, it sort of touches on the different places that the political and the personal hold. You know, one way that we think about the political is that the political is somehow, you know, abstracting, general, not specific, sometimes, you know, oppressive, and the personal is anarchistic by temperament, you know, and rebellious and specific. Maybe that's, you know. But I want to suggest that maybe there's another way, you know, that in a sense and that's maybe the place of the novel. You know, the place of the novel is somewhere in between of those things, you know, where it is interested in connections, and it's interested in how these things reverberate, you know, against one another.
Sadly, we've run out of time. If you haven't read either of these two novels or anything that Hisham's read, I urge you to do so. I've enjoyed so much, as ever, speaking to you, Hisham. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hisham. Thank you so much, Razia, for what was an incredible session to kickstart this wonderful Sunday of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Our next talk, Vox, with Nicholson.